Hi, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started and let people trickle in as we do some intro stuff. My name is Kenny Olmstead. I'm an Internet Privacy and Security Analyst with the Internet Society, and thank you for joining our webinar on our latest report. Our organization is ready for new privacy regulations. Just do some quick intro of who we are, and I'm going to kick it over to my colleague after that for another brief intro on our big work, and then I will dive deep into the privacy stuff. So first, my name is Kenny. My colleague Jeff Wilbur is on the call as well. We both work on the Internet Society's Online Trust Alliance, and our main report is the Online Trust Audit, which this report's data comes from. I'm going to let Jeff do a quick overview of the audit itself, which was released in April of this year, just to give some context to what this report is based on, and then I'll dive into the privacy statement data. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Kenny. Yes, we have done 10 of these online trust audits. The one in April, our most recent. And what we're trying to do is look at the security practices and stated privacy practices of organizations and assess those using a methodology that kind of evolves year to year, looking at kind of the latest best practices. So we're trying to drive adoption and awareness, as it says here. One of our mantras for a long time has been to move beyond compliance. In other words, the minimum that you have to do to meet a regulation or something, to stewardship, do the right thing. And so in many cases, our advocated best practices are beyond what's required from a compliance mindset. And we really want to look at this holistically. So improving data security, both for websites and email, as well as privacy practices to do the best for the consumers and users of these services. And then associated with our audit is an honor roll. So we recognize leadership in this area, so that kind of point to people who are doing the right thing, and hopefully that inspires others to do that as well. So Kenny, if you can advance the slide, we'll talk about kind of what we look at in a little more detail, and then who we look at. So this also has evolved over the years. We looked at more than 1,100 organizations in this most recent audit, 500 top retailers, top 100 banks, consumer services. You can see the list there, so I won't go through it. Most of the sectors are sized at 100 organizations. And we look at these three key areas that I mentioned before. Consumer protection is largely email authentication and domain protection. So it's protecting consumers from receiving fraudulent emails or domain type requests online. We look at the website security of the organizations, and then of course privacy, which we're going to drill into today. So for each of those areas, we have a scoring methodology that evolves. As I mentioned, and I'll just kind of mention the privacy area since we're focusing on that today. All of this information is available on our website in terms of the full audit, and we did a webinar about this audit back in April. But in the privacy area, there are baseline points kind of shown in the grayish block there, bonus points for other things, and then penalties for others. So I'll just walk through these very quickly. The 100 baseline points are split into roughly two halves. The privacy statement itself, which you can see all the details that we look at: data sharing language, data retention, what you say about sharing with third parties, do not track disclosure. Do you have layered notices? In other words, are they kind of laid out in a way that's easy to navigate? Do you have a link on your homepage to the privacy statement, a very basic thing, and so forth. The italics there for previous version available is every year this evolves. And so in the prior year, the previous version available was actually bonus points, and it moved to baseline for our most recent audit. The other thing we look at that's worth a lot of points is what trackers do you actually have on your websites, and do they then share data with third parties without restriction or with little restriction? So you start with 45 points, and then those you get deductions for every kind of promiscuous tracker, so to speak, that's on your website. So that's kind of how the baseline points are broken out. The bonus points are use of icons, further navigation help. Do you disclose that you track across devices? And many sites do. Honoring do not track. Do you have multilingual privacy statements? Do you use a tag management solution? This year, we added a component in bonus scoring related to the GDPR compliant language. And actually, Kenny will be walking through a lot of the details associated with that. But given that regulation has kind of inspired a lot of updates to privacy regulations around the world, we thought it'd be useful to kind of map to that for now. And then going forward, we'll be looking more broadly, I think. And then penalties if you have a private registration versus public, that's a transparency issue. If you had a data breach incident, we scale the penalty to the size of the breach. And then do you have any settlements with governing entities of various kinds around the world? And so that is, are you handling data protection properly? And if not, you get penalized. So that's kind of the makeup of how we looked at this and the type of data we collected. So that's the source we had to work with when we were looking in more detail about how this maps to various regulations around the world.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Two things, just bookkeeping things I should have mentioned at the top. We have a Q&A section and a chat. You can put questions in either of those and we'll answer them as best we can. And this is being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, please let us know. As Jeff mentioned, the goal of this report was to take this rich data set we have of 1,200 privacy statements that we read and score across 29 variables that the Online Trust Alliance has developed over a decade. The punchline is that many organizations' privacy statements are not ready for these upcoming laws. And we should also point out that we are purely looking at their public privacy statements as an indicator of both the statement's quality and if these companies are adhering to best practices. But we as a private organization can't know if these companies are actually doing what they're saying, but governments will. And that's why we thought it was important to take our data set and our standards and try and map them to these larger concepts from laws around the world. We chose these three basically because they're all well established and they're all very large economies, but it should be said that these are not the only three, obviously, and the themes that we pulled out of these three are very common in virtually every privacy law that's been written and is being written currently. So the first is the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. This went into effect about a year ago in May. It affects all businesses that do business in the EU, all organizations that do business in the EU. So it is a very broad law. Many of our standards map to some of the concepts, and I'll get into that in the next slide. The Personal Information Protection and Electronic Document Act, PIPEDA, in Canada, is the older one of these laws. It was first passed in April 2000, but it is reviewed every 7 years by Parliament and was last amended in June 2015. It also covers many of the same concepts, and really any business that any organization that does business in Canada is affected by this. And then finally, the young end of the group, the California Consumer Privacy Act. This goes into effect in January. It affects all businesses that do work in California, and California is the 5th largest economy in the world, so that's most businesses. And that's part of the reason that we felt our data set is interesting with these, because we look at 1,200 very large organizations, many of whom operate in all of these jurisdictions. And so being aware of how your standards map to these is important for really any business now. So these are the principles we pulled out. These, again, are not all the topics covered in these laws, obviously, but these are the ones we felt that our variables maps nicely to, and so we could give an indication of whether our sample is doing a good job with these. Oops, sorry, two more. Most of these are pretty straightforward. Users need to be able to know why their information is being collected. That's a big one in all three of these laws and many others. Whether their information be sold and shared. What's key about this is it's not every time it's shared. You just have to tell users that you're going to share their data, which virtually every business that collects data does. This is basically, this next one came out in GDPR, but is also in CCPA and is now being included in lots of others. Users need access to their data. It's sometimes called data portability. They need to be able to at least download it, usually delete it. And if they download it, it has to be in an easily readable format. This is something that is new and companies in the US are not currently required to do, but will be once CCPA goes into effect. So that is certainly something that is going to be important for companies to understand. And then finally, users must be notified in an easily understandable way. This is really where our data comes in the most, since we actually read these statements. All of these laws include some provision that you have to tell users their rights, and you have to be able to tell it in a way that everyone can understand, regardless of education level, et cetera. That's something we'll get into later on down in the slides. So the first area where in our audit, most of the privacy statement failing happens in data sharing language. It's usually that either the data sharing language is not sufficient enough, or it just doesn't exist at all. So in a good way, the 67% of the organizations with that had a statement saying they do not share or sell data. That's good, but not enough. In these new laws, you really have to say either we don't share data, or if we do, why and to whom. Third-party compliance is something that OTA has advocated for years. This essentially says, our organization has these privacy standards. We hold all of the vendors we work with and any company we share data with to the same standards. As you can see, just over half of the organizations had that statement. This is incredibly important, especially with how prevalent data sharing is. If you, as an organization, are not holding your vendors or partners to the same standards, then how can the user know that their data is being protected if it's being sent back and forth? Data retention is one where it's very bad, and this is also incredibly important, and also something that these newer laws, GDPR, CCPA, many others, really hit on, that you have to have data retention language that tells the user how long and why they're going to keep your data. Part of the reason for this is that a lot of data breaches include data that arguably the organizations didn't need to have. They either just kept it for whatever reason, or they just sort of got left in some Amazon S3 bucket or something. So this is incredibly important and going to become more important as these laws go into effect. The next variable is if they use third-party data. This essentially is not about companies collecting data on users, but if they're buying data from other companies, or if they're the recipient from a sharing agreement. We think that this is important for the same reason third-party compliance is important. It tells users, not only are we collecting data on you, but we're also getting data on you from other people. And ideally, it would also have who those organizations are, or at least the categories, which we'll come to in the next slide. And then finally, explain why data is shared. This one, as you can see, most organizations do this. There's a kind of a loophole here when our standard is fairly low compared to the laws. An organization would get points for this if they gave literally any indication as to why they're collecting data, for user testing or whatever. And many of the laws, including the ones that we looked at, this is much more specific. And that's part of the reason OTA evolves its standards over time, is that these laws change and companies are no longer, they can't get away with just saying, we share it for some vague reason. They have to literally list certain specific cases about why they do that. Next one. So this one may seem trivial, but it's actually really important. It's something that really got put to the top of the list in GDPR and CCPA and many other laws. You have to have a contact at your organization. And specifically, you have to have a contact to either the data protection officer, so DPO stands for, or some sort of privacy or data email address. That is a requirement. And our standard last year is actually lower because that's not currently the case in America. So less than half of the companies had a contact. And even then, most of them were just generic email addresses. It would just be contact@whatever.com. That is not sufficient under most current laws. You would need to be able to contact the privacy department or whatever specifically. And then that relates to the next one, is the reason that contact is so important is because users now need to know, A, what data an organization has about them, their rights to that data, and what the process is if they want to delete it or download it. Here again, our standard is slightly lower than the current laws because this is not affecting American companies currently, but under GDPR and CCPA, you need to explain to users exactly how they can get that information and what the steps are to do that next. This is actually something that in the EU has had fines happen already, where they found, I think it was in Poland, where a company had not had sufficient ways for users to access their data. So this is becoming more important, and really it's in organizations' interest. I mean, if they want to be transparent about this, having a way for their consumers to contact them is incredibly important. And readability. This one is one where our standards are very similar and much more specific than most of the laws around the world. We think that's a good thing. From our perspective, we have had these very specific ways to make your statement more readable for quite a long time. Most of the privacy laws around the world are not hyper specific like this. They make sort of general points where it has to be up to a certain reading level, 6th grade in the US or whatever in other countries. We had not done that in the past. We are debating doing it in the next audit, using some more specific standards. But so these variables are ones that really, some of them are formatting. A layered notice really is a very simple way to make these incredibly long privacy statements. And as the person who read these, I can attest that layering it is important. It can be done with something as simple as a table of contents. You just lay out at the top that, these are the sections you're about to read. Here's what they are. Ideally, it would be better than that. It would be more like a table of contents with links, or a summary of the privacy statement at the top, or some sort of other interactive way where users can really jump to where they want to see it. As you can see, less than half of companies or organizations even had that. And I will say, as the person who scored most of these, the layering was pretty much the table of contents was the way most of them went. They were not super sophisticated in this. This is incredibly important for a lot of reasons. One, users need to be able to find what they're looking for. And two, it just makes it simpler. It makes it less scary. Privacy statements can be pretty intimidating. And as we sort of know anecdotally, most people don't read them, and they need to. And so putting this in place can really help organizations just make it easier for users to see what's happening with their data and then go from there. Icons are another way to do that. This also can help across languages. As you can see, icons are rarely used. We saw very, very few organizations that used icons. Icons are a good way to make these huge blocks of text easier to understand. But to be fair, there is a good reason why some organizations, most organizations at least in our sample, don't do this. There isn't a common language for these icons yet. There are organizations working on that. But for the moment, there is no sort of microphone for sharing or whatever. So it is sort of kind of understandable why that would be. Multilingual is another one where we were pretty surprised that this was so low. Obviously, companies that operate in lots of different countries need to have their privacy statements in multiple languages. Part of the reason for this may be that they may be using their browser detection to see where the person is coming from and changing the language, but still, it would be much simpler if organizations had their privacy statement just easily available and clickable, English, Spanish, French, whatever. The ones that we did see, the very few, that's usually how it was structured. It was just a button at the top that said, for English, for Spanish, for whatever. And then finally, the link on the homepage is something that OTA has advocated for a very long time. This is obviously important because if you can't find the privacy statement, then what's the point of even having it? As you can see, most organizations had it on the homepage. It's usually where I think most people would expect to find it, at the bottom and sort of grayed out. The laws around the world, again, are not that specific about where you need to put the link to the privacy statement, but they are very clear that you have to have a privacy statement. We actually had a few organizations that didn't even have privacy statements, which that's just, you can't do that anymore. That world is over. And it's really in an organization's interest to have it easily visible. Hiding a privacy statement doesn't really make a lot of sense. You put a lot of work into it, users should be able to find it, so put it prominently somewhere. That's certainly something that we would advocate strongly. This next one is sort of related to the previous readability. This is really about informing users when privacy policies change. I'm sure that all of you who get emailed noticed that in June of 2018, July of 2018, you started getting emails basically every day from the organizations you work with saying, we updated our privacy policy, here it is. That was because of GDPR. The reason those emails started coming was because of that. And what changed was, before GDPR, and in the US currently, actually, you don't have to inform a user when you make a change. You just have to put it on the privacy statement somewhere, which is where our 3 variables these 4 variables, actually, what we advocated was the way to do it. We, for a long time, said, put a date stamp at the top, which you can see most organizations do, or at the bottom, or somewhere. But still, 30% of organizations didn't have a date stamp, and that's really not good. And then finally, access to a prior version is a way where you put if you change the privacy policy, you just put a new copy up and keep the old version. That way users can compare and contrast between the two, or put a short statement at the top saying, we changed our privacy statement. Here it is. Here's a bulleted list of what changed. Bang, bang, bang. What's changing, as I said earlier, is in GDPR and CCPA and all these new laws. It is no longer, you have to be proactive about this now. You can't just update your privacy statement and change the date. You have to tell the users not only what changed, but you have to contact them directly. This is something that I think won't go away anytime soon, and organizations are really going to need to do that because fines are organized around that in some sense. And also, it's just for a transparency issue. It's just good to tell users what changes, and if it's a small change, that's fine. But major changes need to be told. And as we know, most users probably aren't reading the privacy statement, let alone checking the date or comparing versions. So you just send an email saying, we updated our privacy policy. If you want to read it, here it is, go. So finally, just some concluding thoughts on this. The biggest challenge we see for most organizations, especially large organizations, is that they need to be aware of the laws that the jurisdictions they operate in. There are a lot, especially given that there are more laws popping up around the world. We just picked 3, GDPR, PIPEDA, and CCPA, but there are new laws in Thailand, Portugal, Brazil. I could go on and on and on. At least a dozen different US states have different privacy laws coming down the pipe than CCPA. There's talk of a federal privacy law. So really, the onus is on organizations to keep up with all of this change. The good news, as we pointed out earlier, is that most of these laws are very similar. Their sort of principles are almost identical. A lot of them come from the OECD principles that came out in 1980 something. How they implement those, however, do differ. So while you need to be aware that most of these laws are generally the same, in their specifics, they can be different. So GDPR may treat readability differently than CCPA does, or they may treat, proactively contacting users. There may be a different time frame. You have to do it in 30 days or 60 days, so those details do matter because that's how the fines are assessed and how companies or how organizations are graded. However, adhering to sort of the general principles that OTA advocates, and just understanding that is really going to go quite a long way. So I actually see a question, which I think I can ask. Oh, definitely. It's extremely important to establish a privacy team, and the roles can certainly play different. I mean, I would also say that yes, there should be a privacy team, but I'm sure you've heard this about IT teams as well, that this is everybody's job at a company, because virtually at an organization, virtually everyone is going to come in contact with these new laws in some way in their work. I would say the privacy team's job is to keep everyone aware of these changes and what happens, and yes, obviously the privacy team is going to have lawyers, but there's also other roles. There's designers and people to help make the statements more readable. There's people to help make the privacy standards within the organization work. I mean, that's another thing. I think I pointed this out earlier, but to reiterate, we are simply looking at the privacy statement about what these companies say they're going to do. They're going to be held to a very different standard with governments. Governments are going to ask, do audits of their data handling. So the privacy team, we're going to call its job, is to both keep up with the changes, but also make sure that the policies of the organization are adhering and actually doing what they're saying they're doing. See another question. No, there aren't truly international data protection agreements at the moment. There has been talk of that for a long time. In international trade agreements, you will see that happen occasionally, where when cross-border data flows are being discussed, they will include data protection and privacy agreements within that. There is no sort of global privacy data protection yet. But clearly, I will say GDPR set the tone a year or two ago. CCPA is very similar. The new ones are very similar. So really, even though there isn't a sort of standard around the world, most of these laws are so similar that it's pretty easy to at least keep up with the general concepts as they move. Of course, depending on how big an organization is, that can get super complicated, right? If you're operating in 30 countries and the European Union, then you're going to need a much larger team to handle all that. But at the end of the day, it's in their interests. If they don't, the GDPR fines can get high, and we haven't, obviously CCPA isn't in effect yet, but they can get high as well. I think that's all I have for the conclusion.
Kenny, I have one other question that came in privately.
Okay.
And it says, why pull out principles from these 3 laws rather than look at the laws themselves?
Sure, that's a great question. The reason for that is because our OTA standards that have been developed over the last decade or so are not about compliance. They're about stewardship. And we feel that, you certainly could look at each law individually, but that gets incredibly complicated. And frankly, the data set we have at the moment that we collected for the audit just isn't granular enough. GDPR is somewhere around 3,000 pages long. And so to go through each individual one would be complicated. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It's just that from our organizational perspective, it's just too much work. It would be a huge challenge. But companies or organizations will have to do that. It's on some level, to get down to the nitty gritty of, what's very specific regulation do you have to follow in your case. But I will say all 3 of these actually, and most privacy laws, once they get passed, have very robust tools for organizations to learn about this. The GDPR has a whole website that is just dedicated to teaching organizations what to do, how to avoid fines, who to talk to, who to call. And so they're not being silent about how to help organizations deal with these new laws. And any other questions?
Hey, Kenny, this is Jeff.
Sure.
I know a question we've had in some other venues was, given that all these regulations are changing, especially this year and last around the world, how will we be assessing privacy statements in our audit going forward?
Yeah, that is a good question. So last year we added for the first time 5 variables that were specific to GDPR. This year we're going to be broadening those out even more to cover that exact question. We will be looking at all the new laws, pulling out variables we think that are important for that. The other thing that I think we'll be doing is looking at our variables and trying to either tweak them to fit these regulations more directly, or just adding more. The readability is a good place that I think we could improve sort of our look at it, because most of these laws do have super specific rules about that. The other place would be data sharing. The data sharing language, our standards are basically the same as any of these new laws, but the laws are sort of specific in how those should be written and what to do with that. And so I think we'll be changing slightly some of our variables just to make them more in line with a lot of these new laws. And again, even comparing GDPR to CCPA, they're so similar. In the privacy world, CCPA is often referred to as GDPR light. That I think it would be pretty easy for us and in our interest to sort of just take them and look at them and say, look, if you're a company that operating in the EU right now, you're probably doing roughly the same things you're going to need to do if you're operating in California. And the same thing would probably be true for most of these other places.
Kenny, I have one more question, and it says, where can companies go to keep up with these changing laws?
Yes, that is hard. There are a couple of organizations that I would point to. The main one would be the International Association of Privacy Professionals. They do a good job of rounding up all this stuff as it's changing. Not only internationally, but in the United States, it's even more complicated because individual states are doing it on their own. And they actually have a pretty good sort of running list of states' laws, where they are in the process and how they're changing. There are a couple of other organizations. I mean, if you go to the GDPR website, they actually point to other laws that are sort of similar and sort of say, look, if you are operating in the EU, you need to do this, but here's some other ones that are based sort of roughly on the same concept. So yeah, I would say the IAPP is probably the best place off the top of my head. Oh, I see that. FTSS companies. So actually, to our standards, yes. I mean, we assessed all of these organizations, and then we actually in
Kenny,
the report.
could you read the question? I don't think the
sure.
can see it. Thanks.
Okay. Yep. So after you assess companies and find them deficient, what happens next? Do you offer assistance? Are there places companies can go to help ensure compliance? So there are places companies can go to help ensure compliance. That's not exactly what we do, but for our stewardship concept and for all of our variables, we are very open that if companies want to come to us and talk about all the principles that we cover in the audit, not just privacy, we cover security and other topics in the audit. We're very happy to talk to any company that's interested in learning about our best practices. I mean, best practices is really what we do. We are sort of a step away from laws, but we do think that our best practices, if you follow them, will essentially get you pretty close to full compliance with regulations. See any other questions? I don't think so.
I have no more questions in the queue.
Okay. Great. Well, if anybody has any other further questions or wants any more information from us, feel free to reach out to anybody, me or Jeff or just the Online Trust Alliance or the Internet Society. We're happy to help. We have another audit coming out next year. We're starting the data collection for that right now and updating our privacy variables and security variables. If you go to our website, you can see the methodology for this year's audit is posted. It was posted yesterday. If anybody has any questions or thoughts on that, please let us know. We're always open for input to update this stuff, and especially the privacy statements are complicated, and so adding anything that would be helpful for us would be great.
All right. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm going to stop recording now. And thanks for joining us. We will get the recording up and point everybody to it. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.